On the night of March 1st, 1953, Joseph Stalin collapsed at his dacha in Kuntsevo, outside Moscow. He had spent the evening as he often did, watching a film, drinking heavily with members of his inner circle, sending them home in the early morning hours. Beria, Malenkov, Khrushchev, and Bulganin left around 4 in the morning, relieved to escape another night of ritualized humiliation. Stalin retired to his private quarters. And then silence. The paranoia that had defined Stalin's final years now manifested in its most grotesque form. His guards, terrified of disturbing him without permission, waited hours before checking on him. They had been trained too well, conditioned too thoroughly to fear overstepping boundaries. When a guard finally entered Stalin's room late in the day on March 2nd, he found the dictator lying on the floor in a puddle of urine, unable to speak, partially paralyzed. A stroke had rendered the most powerful man in the Soviet Union helpless, trapped in his own body, unable to command, unable to threaten, unable to control. The delay in discovering Stalin proved catastrophic for any chance of recovery. But even more revealing was what happened next. His inner circle hesitated to call for medical help. Beria and Malenkov arrived at the dacha and, after assessing the situation, decided to wait. They claimed later that Stalin appeared to be sleeping, that they didn't want to disturb him. But the truth was more sinister and more understandable. Calling doctors meant making a decision, taking initiative, potentially being blamed if Stalin recovered and disapproved of their actions. The system Stalin had created had so thoroughly eliminated independent judgment that even in a medical emergency, even when his life hung in balance, the men around him were paralyzed by fear of making the wrong choice. Hours passed. Stalin remained on the floor, his brain bleeding, his body shutting down, while the leaders of the Soviet Union debated what to do, each terrified of being the one responsible for whatever came next. When doctors were finally summoned, nearly a full day after Stalin's collapse, they arrived terrified. Many of the Soviet Union's best physicians had been arrested in the doctor's plot just weeks earlier. The doctors who examined Stalin knew that if he died, they might be accused of murder. If he survived but remained incapacitated, they might be blamed for inadequate treatment. There was no scenario in which they were safe. They diagnosed a massive cerebral hemorrhage. They applied leeches, and outdated treatment that reflected both the primitive state of Soviet medicine and the doctor's terror of doing anything that might be construed as aggressive intervention. They monitored his vital signs and waited. Stalin's daughter Svetlana was brought to the dacha. His son Vasily arrived drunk, shouting accusations that his father had been poisoned, that the doctors were killing him deliberately. For 4 days, Joseph Stalin lingered between life and death, while the men who had served him began maneuvering for succession. Beria alternated between showing concern when Stalin appeared conscious and making jokes about his condition when he seemed unconscious. Khrushchev watched everything, calculating, remembering. The power struggle had already begun even as the man they all feared still drew breath. The death itself, when it finally came on March 5, 1953, was described officially as peaceful, but witnesses reported something different. A final moment of consciousness when Stalin's eyes opened, surveyed the room full of subordinates, and then, according to some accounts, he raised his left hand in what might have been a gesture of rage or curse before collapsing back into death. Even in dying, Stalin seemed to be accusing, threatening, condemning those around him. The immediate aftermath revealed the true nature of the fear Stalin had generated. Within hours of his death, Beria moved to release political prisoners and dismantle some of the more extreme apparatus of terror, not out of compassion or justice, but out of pragmatic recognition that the system had become unsustainable, that the paranoia had paralyzed the Soviet state's ability to function. Khrushchev would later deliver his secret speech in 1956, denouncing Stalin's crimes and cult of personality, though carefully avoiding any examination of his own complicity in those crimes. But the question that haunts Stalin's final years isn't about his death. It's about what his paranoia reveals about the nature of authoritarian power itself. Stalin had achieved something that previous dictators had only aspired to: total control over a vast empire, the elimination of all institutional checks on his authority, the transformation of an entire society into a reflection of his will. And yet this absolute power generated not security, but perpetual terror, not confidence, but consuming suspicion. The night Stalin stopped trusting everyone marked the moment when he crossed a threshold from which there was no return. He had always been ruthless, always been suspicious, always been willing to sacrifice others for his vision of power. But in those final years, the strategic paranoia that had helped him survive and dominate metastasized into something pathological, something that consumed not just his enemies but his allies, not just potential threats but loyal servants, not just the guilty but the innocent.
The tragedy, if such a word can be applied to a man responsible for millions of deaths, is that Stalin understood intellectually what he was doing. He knew that his purges were destroying competent administrators, talented generals, skilled professionals. He knew that the terror was economically inefficient, socially destructive, strategically counterproductive. But he couldn't stop. The psychological mechanism that had driven his rise to power had become autonomous, operating beyond rational calculation, beyond strategic necessity. In the end, Stalin died as he had lived, isolated, suspicious, surrounded by people who feared him too much to help him. The guards who waited too long to check on him, the subordinates who hesitated to call doctors, the physicians who were too terrified to provide aggressive treatment, they were all products of the system he had created. A system where the safest choice was always inaction, where initiative was punished, where the only way to survive was to do nothing until explicitly ordered. The Soviet Union would survive Stalin's death by nearly 4 decades, but it would never fully recover from the damage his paranoia inflicted. The talent destroyed in the purges, the trust annihilated by constant surveillance, the initiative crushed by fear of reprisal, these wounds shaped Soviet society until its final collapse. Future leaders would denounce Stalin, would dismantle some of his worst excesses, but the fundamental dynamic he established, that power flows from the ability to generate fear, would persist. The night Stalin stopped trusting everyone wasn't just a moment in one man's psychological deterioration. It was a demonstration of a fundamental truth about authoritarian power, that the mechanisms used to seize and maintain control inevitably turn inward, that the paranoia required to eliminate all opposition eventually consumes the paranoid themselves, that absolute power doesn't corrupt absolutely, it isolates absolutely, until the dictator sits alone in a fortress of his own making, surrounded by servants who are too terrified to save him, ruling over a wasteland of fear that he himself created. Stalin's final legacy is not the Soviet victory in World War II, not the industrialization of Russia, not the expansion of communist influence. His legacy is the demonstration that political power divorced from institutional constraints, from human connection, from the basic ability to trust, becomes its own form of prison, where the guard and the prisoner are the same person, where the sentence is life, and where the only escape is death. In his final moments, unable to speak, unable to move, Stalin experienced what millions of his victims had experienced: absolute helplessness, the terror of being at the mercy of others' decisions. The difference was that his victims had at least known who their enemy was. Stalin died not knowing if he was being helped or murdered, if the doctors were trying to save him or kill him, if his subordinates were loyal or conspiring. He died trapped in the paranoid reality he had created, where trust was impossible and everyone was guilty until proven otherwise, and proof was never sufficient. The dictator who had stopped trusting everyone died trusting no one, and no one mourned him except from fear of being noticed for not mourning. It was a fitting end for a man who had turned suspicion into statecraft and loneliness into a governing philosophy.
The paradox of absolute power is that it generates absolute vulnerability. Stalin had constructed a system where he alone made decisions, where every thread of authority led back to him, where the entire Soviet apparatus existed as an extension of his will. But this very centralization meant that he could trust no institution, no process, no person, because everything depended on human loyalty. And human loyalty, as Stalin understood better than anyone, was infinitely corruptible. By 1952, Stalin's inner circle had learned to communicate in a language of silence and suggestion. Direct conversation had become too dangerous. Beria would hint at potential threats through carefully constructed reports. Malenkov would signal his positions through the positioning of papers on Stalin's desk. Khrushchev would gauge Stalin's mood through the films he chose to screen. They had all become students of a master who communicated primarily through unpredictability, whose favor could shift in an instant, whose rage could be triggered by the smallest perceived slight. The psychology driving Stalin's paranoia was rooted in projection. He understood power through the lens of his own rise, through betrayal, manipulation, and the ruthless elimination of rivals. He had turned on Lenin's other heirs, destroying Trotsky, Zinoviev, Kamenev, Bukharin. He had fabricated evidence, coerced confessions, rewritten history itself to erase his enemies from photographs and textbooks. If he could do this, if he had done this, then surely others were capable of the same methods. The logic was inescapable. Trust was suicide. This projection extended to his understanding of international relations. Stalin viewed the Western powers through the same paranoid framework. Every diplomatic gesture concealed hostile intent. Every offer of cooperation masked a plot. The Marshall Plan wasn't economic assistance to rebuild war-torn Europe. It was capitalist encirclement, a conspiracy to strangle the Soviet Union economically. NATO wasn't a defensive alliance. It was preparation for invasion. This worldview wasn't entirely delusional. The West did seek to contain Soviet expansion,
But Stalin's interpretation stripped away any possibility of nuance, reducing complex geopolitical dynamics to a simple equation. Everyone was plotting against him. The Korean War, which began in 1950, intensified these fears. Stalin had given his approval for North Korea's invasion of the South, but he did so carefully, ensuring that Soviet involvement remained deniable, that Soviet pilots flew with North Korean markings, that Soviet advisors operated in the shadows. The war's progression, initial North Korean success, then American intervention, then Chinese involvement, then bloody stalemate, demonstrated the limits of Soviet power. Stalin had sought to expand communist influence without direct confrontation with America, but the result was a grinding conflict that consumed resources and highlighted the Soviet Union's vulnerability. Domestically, this external threat provided justification for renewed internal repression. The Mingrelian Affair of 1951-1952 targeted Georgian officials, including many from Beria's own power base. Stalin accused them of nationalism, of plotting to separate Georgia from the Soviet Union and align it with the West. The irony was exquisite. Stalin himself was Georgian, but he had long since transcended any ethnic or national identity, becoming instead a personification of Soviet power itself. His assault on Georgian officials was partly about undermining Beria, who had become too powerful, too independent, too much of a potential threat. But it was also about something deeper, Stalin's need to continuously remake the power structure, to prevent any institutional or personal relationships from solidifying into potential opposition. By keeping everyone off balance, by constantly shifting the targets of repression, by making survival dependent on day-to-day submission rather than past service, Stalin ensured that no coalition could form against him. Yesterday's executioner could be tomorrow's victim. Yesterday's victim's position could be filled by someone who understood that their own survival was temporary, conditional, revocable. The meetings of the Politburo during this period were exercises in collective terror. Stalin would arrive late, forcing his subordinates to wait in anxious silence. He would make decisions capriciously, overruling carefully prepared recommendations on a whim. He would sometimes leave in the middle of discussions, returning hours later to see if anyone had dared to continue the meeting without him. No one ever did. They would sit in silence, afraid to speak, afraid to leave, trapped in a limbo of anticipation and dread. Stalin's sleep patterns had become erratic, another manifestation of his deteriorating mental state. He would work through the night, summoning ministers at 3 or 4 in the morning to discuss trivial matters. His insomnia was partly physical, the aging process, possible heart problems, the effects of decades of stress and excess. But it was also psychological, a manifestation of the same paranoia that drove his political calculations. Sleep meant vulnerability. Sleep meant loss of control. Sleep meant trusting that he would wake up, that no one would use those hours of unconsciousness to move against him. The guards at his dacha operated under impossible instructions. They were to maintain constant surveillance, but never be intrusive. They were to be immediately available, but never presumptuously present. They were rotated frequently to prevent them from becoming familiar with Stalin's routines, from developing the kind of knowledge that could be used to plan an attack. Some were arrested on fabricated charges after their service ended, ensuring that their knowledge of Stalin's private life died with them in the camps. Stalin's relationship with his own children had long since deteriorated into dysfunction. His son Yakov had died in German captivity during the war, possibly by suicide, after Stalin refused a prisoner exchange, reportedly saying, "I will not trade a marshal for a lieutenant." His son Vasily had become an alcoholic wastrel, kept in nominal positions but stripped of real authority. His daughter Svetlana was the only one he showed any affection toward, but even that relationship was poisoned by his suspicion and control. When Svetlana fell in love with Alexei Kapler, a Jewish filmmaker, he had him arrested and sent to the camps. The message was clear. Even his daughter's personal life was subject to his approval, his control. Love was a weakness. Attachment was vulnerability. The only acceptable relationship was submission to his authority. The architecture Stalin had built, both political and psychological, was now collapsing inward. The system designed to protect him had become a cage. The isolation meant to ensure security had generated a different kind of danger. No one could tell him the truth. No one could offer genuine counsel. No one could help him navigate the challenges facing the Soviet Union because everyone was too terrified of being perceived as disloyal. His health was deteriorating, but his doctors were afraid to diagnose serious conditions, afraid to recommend treatments that might fail, afraid to tell him anything that might provoke his rage. The very people responsible for keeping him alive were paralyzed by fear of being accused of trying to kill him. The doctor's plot had ensured that medical care itself had become a minefield of potential accusations. In the early months of 1953, Stalin began planning another massive purge. The evidence suggests he intended to move against the remaining members of the Politburo, to cleanse the system once more, to reset the power structure entirely. The doctor's plot was meant to be merely the opening act, a prelude to a purge that would rival the terror of the 1930s. Lists were being compiled, accusations were being prepared, the machinery of terror was spinning up once more. But Stalin's body, pushed beyond endurance by decades of stress, excess, and paranoia, was reaching its limits. The night he stopped trusting everyone had set in motion a psychological and political dynamic that ultimately would consume him.
The machinery of Stalin's paranoia required constant feeding. Like a beast that grew hungrier with each meal, his suspicion demanded ever more elaborate systems of surveillance, control, and terror. And in the years following that pivotal night, The Soviet Union transformed into a hall of mirrors, where reality itself became negotiable, where truth was whatever Stalin declared it to be, and where the greatest danger wasn't opposition, it was proximity to power. The Doctor's Plot of 1952-1953 stands as perhaps the most grotesque manifestation of Stalin's final descent. In January 1953, Soviet newspapers announced the discovery of a vast conspiracy. A group of predominantly Jewish doctors, many of them Stalin's own personal physicians, had allegedly been murdering Soviet leaders through deliberate medical malpractice. The accusations were absurd, the confessions obviously extracted through torture, the evidence fabricated. But in Stalin's Soviet Union, plausibility was irrelevant. What mattered was the narrative's utility. The Doctor's Plot served multiple purposes in Stalin's psychological architecture. First, it provided an external enemy, Jewish conspirators working for Western intelligence agencies, to explain any potential health problems Stalin might be experiencing. Second, it allowed him to purge the medical establishment, replacing doctors who knew too much about his declining health with new ones who understood that their survival depended on keeping him alive. Third, and perhaps most importantly, it sent a message to his inner circle. No one was safe, not even those whose literal job was to keep him breathing. But the plot also revealed something deeper about Stalin's mental state. He had begun to view his own body as enemy territory, a battleground where treachery could manifest through a misdiagnosed symptom or a deliberately prescribed medication. His hypochondria merged seamlessly with his paranoia, creating a feedback loop where every ache, every moment of weakness, became evidence of conspiracy. The man who had once been vigorous, who had worked 18-hour days orchestrating the industrialization of an entire nation, now spent hours obsessing over his pulse, his blood pressure, the color of his urine. Lavrentiy Beria, the head of the NKVD and perhaps the only man Stalin genuinely feared, watched this deterioration with calculating eyes. Beria was a monster in his own right, a serial rapist and sadist who had built his career on implementing Stalin's darkest orders. But he was also intelligent enough to recognize that Stalin's paranoia had become a threat not just to individuals, but to the entire system. The purges of the 1930s had at least followed a certain logic, eliminating potential opposition and consolidating power. But this new phase of terror was random, chaotic, consuming loyal servants and potential threats with equal indifference. The Leningrad affair of 1949-1950 demonstrated this perfectly. Stalin orchestrated the destruction of the Leningrad Party organization, executing or imprisoning hundreds of officials on fabricated charges of separatism and conspiracy. The real reason? Leningrad had survived the 900-day Nazi siege with heroism that generated its own mythology, its own narrative of resistance that didn't center on Stalin himself. The city's suffering and survival had created bonds of loyalty that existed independently of Stalin's cult of personality. This was intolerable. Nikolai Voznesky, one of the Soviet Union's most competent economic planners and a potential successor to Stalin, was arrested, tortured, and executed. His crime? Being too effective, too popular, too obviously capable of leadership. Alexei Kuznetsov, another Leningrad leader, met the same fate. The purge consumed not just the leaders, but their families, their associates, anyone who might carry forward their memory or their potential threat. What's crucial to understand is that Stalin no longer needed evidence, no longer bothered with the elaborate show trials that had characterized the 1930s purges. Those trials, grotesque as they were, at least maintained a pretense of legal process, of confession and proof. But by the late 1940s, Stalin had dispensed with such theatrical niceties. People simply disappeared. The accusation itself was proof. The arrest was the verdict. The system had become so thoroughly Stalinized that it operated as an extension of his paranoid impulses, requiring no justification beyond his suspicion. His relationship with Vyacheslav Molotov, his foreign minister and one of his oldest comrades, perfectly illustrated this dynamic. In 1949, Stalin arrested Molotov's wife, Polina Zhemchuzina, on charges of being part of a Zionist conspiracy. Molotov, who had served Stalin faithfully for decades, who had signed death warrants, who had implemented policies that killed millions, was forced to abstain from voting on his own wife's arrest at a Politburo meeting. He did so, knowing that any defense of her would mark him for destruction as well. Stalin watched Molotov's reaction carefully. The message was clear. Your loyalty must be absolute, transcending even marriage, even love. You must be willing to sacrifice everything, your wife, your dignity, your humanity, to demonstrate your submission.
and Molotov, understanding the rules of this nightmare perfectly, complied. He continued to serve Stalin, continued to attend dinners at the dacha, continued to laugh at Stalin's jokes, all while his wife rotted in a labor camp. These late-night gatherings at Stalin's dacha had become ritualized torments. Stalin would force his subordinates to drink heavily, then watch their behavior for signs of disloyalty. He would tell crude jokes and monitor who laughed too enthusiastically or not enthusiastically enough. He would screen American westerns until 4 in the morning, then dismiss his exhausted ministers, knowing they would return to their offices and work another full day on minimal sleep. The sleep deprivation was itself a form of control. Exhausted men make mistakes, reveal weaknesses, become vulnerable. Nikita Khrushchev, who would later denounce Stalin's crimes, recounted these evenings with barely concealed horror. Stalin would sometimes force his ministers to dance, pairing the overweight Khrushchev with the lanky Anastas Mikoyan and laughing as they awkwardly shuffled around the room. The humiliation was deliberate, designed to strip these powerful men of dignity, to remind them that their positions meant nothing, that they were Stalin's playthings, that their lives could end with a word from him. The isolation of Stalin's final years was both physical and psychological. He rarely left his dacha, rarely appeared in public, governing through written orders and late-night phone calls. The man who had once commanded armies now commanded only his terror, reaching out through the vast bureaucracy of the Soviet state to destroy lives with casual instructions. A notation in the margin of a document, a name circled on a list, a phone call in the middle of the night.
There are moments in history when paranoia ceases to be a symptom and becomes a strategy, when suspicion transforms from a psychological flaw into a governing principle. And in the Soviet Union of the late 1940s, one night marked the invisible border between Joseph Stalin's calculated distrust and his complete descent into a world where every shadow concealed a traitor, every smile masked a conspiracy, and loyalty itself became the most dangerous crime of all. Stalin had never been a trusting man. Born Yoseb Bessarionidze Jugashvili in the poverty-stricken town of Gori, Georgia in 1878, he learned early that survival demanded cunning, ruthlessness, and the ability to read betrayal before it materialized. His childhood was marked by violence, a drunken, abusive father, and a desperately protective mother who wanted him to become a priest. Instead, he became something far more terrifying, a man who would reshape the concept of power itself, who would turn an entire nation into an extension of his own psychological landscape. But even for Stalin, there was a before and an after, a threshold moment when his suspicion metastasized into something absolute and all-consuming. That moment came not with a dramatic coup attempt or an assassination plot, but with something far more insidious. The realization that the very people he had elevated to power, the inner circle he had carefully constructed, might be the greatest threat of all. The year was 1948. World War II had ended 3 years earlier, and the Soviet Union stood as one of two global superpowers. Stalin, now in his late 60s, had achieved what seemed impossible. He had defeated Nazi Germany, expanded Soviet influence across Eastern Europe, and solidified his position as the unchallenged leader of a nuclear-armed state. He should have felt secure. Instead, he felt more vulnerable than ever. The architecture of Stalin's paranoia had been under construction for decades. The Great Purge of 1936-1938 had already demonstrated his willingness to destroy anyone, including his closest comrades, on the flimsiest of pretexts. Nikolai Bukharin, once called the darling of the party, was executed. Grigory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev, Lenin's closest associates, were shot. Mikhail Tukhachevsky, the brilliant military strategist, was tortured into confessing to imaginary conspiracies and then killed. The purges consumed hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions, in a machinery of terror that Stalin personally directed, sometimes signing death lists late into the night, casually marking names for execution with a red pencil. But the post-war period introduced new variables into Stalin's psychological equation. The Soviet Union now faced an adversary that couldn't simply be purged or terrorized into submission: the United States. The Cold War had begun, and with it came a form of threat that Stalin's usual methods couldn't entirely neutralize: ideological contamination, Western influence, and the possibility that exposure to the outside world during the war had compromised Soviet citizens' loyalty.
Stalin's wartime generals had seen Paris, Berlin, Vienna. They had witnessed living standards in the West that contradicted decades of Soviet propaganda. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the hero of Stalingrad and Berlin, had been celebrated internationally, his face on magazine covers, his tactical genius recognized globally. For Stalin, this was intolerable. Popularity was treason, recognition was conspiracy, success was suspicion. The incident that catalyzed Stalin's final transformation remains debated by historians, but the most compelling evidence points to a specific evening in late 1948 or early 1949. Stalin had gathered his inner circle at his dacha, Lavrenti Beria, the sadistic head of the secret police, Vyacheslav Molotov, the foreign minister, Georgy Malenkov, Stalin's potential successor, and others. These were men who had survived decades at Stalin's side, who had learned to read his moods, to laugh at his jokes, to drink when he demanded they drink, and to stay silent when silence was required. But that night, something shifted. Some accounts suggest Stalin noticed a glance between Beria and Molotov, a moment of silent communication that excluded him. Others claim he overheard a fragment of conversation that stopped abruptly when he entered a room. Still others point to a letter, possibly fabricated by the secret police themselves, suggesting that his closest associates were meeting without his knowledge. The specific trigger matters less than the psychological avalanche it unleashed. Stalin looked around the table at these men, men he had known for decades, men who owed everything to him, men whose hands were stained with the same blood as his, and he saw strangers. Worse, he saw threats. The realization crystallized with terrifying clarity. If he could betray anyone, then anyone could betray him. The very logic that had sustained his power now turned inward, devouring the possibility of trust itself. What followed was not another dramatic purge, but something more insidious, a systematic dismantling of every personal connection, every institutional relationship, every human bond that Stalin had previously relied upon. He began rotating his guards constantly, ensuring no one spent enough time near him to plan an attack. He stopped eating food unless someone else tasted it first. He installed listening devices in his colleagues' homes and offices. He created overlapping intelligence agencies, each spying on the others, each reporting directly to him, ensuring that loyalty to any organization was impossible. Only loyalty to Stalin himself could exist. The night Stalin stopped trusting everyone wasn't just a personal psychological break. It was the moment when the Soviet state fully merged with one man's pathology, when paranoia became policy, when the entire apparatus of government existed solely to manage one elderly dictator's terror of the people closest to him.